For Nancy, at 67 years old, 38 years of marriage ended with a suitcase on the sidewalk and an ex-husband laughing as he moved into the mansion with his new wife, 30 years younger. Her adult children stayed with their father. Her savings would barely cover 2 months of rent. And when Nancy took her last money and bought a plot of dry land that nobody had wanted for decades, everyone said she'd lost her mind. But Nancy had seen something in that dead earth, that 40 years of botanical knowledge she'd shelved to be a wife, had taught her. And with her own hands, at 67 years old, she began to make the impossible grow. The garden Nancy created left agronomists speechless. But what she cultivated within herself, purpose, strength, the scientist who'd always existed beneath the obedient wife, changed everything. This is Nancy's story. Proof that knowledge never expires. 67 isn't too late, and the best revenge is finally living. Subscribe now, because dreams don't age. Nancy Mitchell was 67 years old and had just learned that 38 years of marriage could end in a single afternoon with a lawyer's signature and a check for $30,000. Her half of the liquid assets after Richard kept the house, the cars, the vacation property, and apparently the loyalty of their adult children. She stood on the sidewalk outside what had been her home for 3 decades, holding a suitcase containing clothes, photo albums, and her mother's jewelry, watching Richard load boxes into his truck with his new wife Melissa, a 37-year-old marketing director he'd met at a conference 2 years ago. Nancy had suspected for months before Richard finally admitted the affair, but by then he'd already moved money, consulted lawyers, and positioned everything so that when the divorce came, Nancy would get the legal minimum and nothing more. The house had been in Richard's name alone. He'd insisted on that back in 1987 when they married, saying it was better for his construction business taxes. Nancy had agreed because she'd loved him and trusted him and believed that marriage meant partnership regardless of whose name was on paperwork. She'd been spectacularly wrong. "Mum, you're being dramatic," her son David had said when she'd called to tell him about the divorce settlement. "Dad's offering you $30,000, that's generous. You can get a nice apartment somewhere." "The house is worth $400,000, Nancy had replied quietly. "I lived there for 30 years. I raised you there. I maintained it, decorated it, made it a home while your father built his business." "Yeah, but it was in Dad's name. Legally, he didn't have to give you anything. He's trying to be fair." Nancy had understood in that moment that her son, her firstborn, the baby she'd rocked through colic and walked to his first day of school and helped through college, had chosen his father's side because his father had money and connections and could help David's own career in commercial real estate. Her daughter Rebecca had been only slightly more sympathetic, but ultimately just as pragmatic. "Mum, I know this is hard, but you need to be realistic. Dad's moving on with Melissa. You should focus on moving on too. Maybe take that money and travel. Find yourself." Find herself. As if Nancy had been lost. As if she hadn't spent 38 years being exactly where she was supposed to be, supporting Richard's business, raising their children, managing their home, being the perfect wife and mother while her own dreams of becoming a botanist slowly died from neglect. Nancy had met Richard in her senior year at North Carolina State University, where she was studying botany with a focus on arid climate agriculture. She'd been fascinated by desert plants, by the resilience of species that could thrive in impossible conditions, by the science of coaxing life from hostile soil. She'd planned to do graduate work, maybe join a research team studying sustainable agriculture in developing regions. Then she'd met Richard at a friend's party, and he'd been charming and ambitious, and he'd made her feel like the most important person in the world. They'd married 6 months after graduation. Too fast, everyone said, but Nancy had been in love, and Richard had been insistent. "You don't need graduate school," he'd told her. "I'm going to build an empire, and I want you by my side. We'll travel. We'll build a life together. You can always go back to botany later if you want." Later never came. David was born a year after the wedding, Rebecca 3 years after that. Richard's construction business took off, requiring constant attention and networking and social obligations, where Nancy played the supportive wife. The years accumulated like sediment, and Nancy's botany degree gathered dust in a box in the attic, along with her research papers and the plants she'd once loved cultivating. Now at 67, standing on a sidewalk with a suitcase and $30,000 that was supposed to be enough to start over, Nancy felt something she hadn't felt in decades, a peculiar clarity born from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Nancy spent the first month after the divorce in a cheap extended-stay motel, watching her savings dwindle while she searched for affordable housing. Rent in any decent area was impossible on her limited budget. She'd have maybe enough for a year in a small apartment if she was extremely careful. And then what? Her teacher's pension from the 3 years she'd worked before David was born provided just $700 monthly, not nearly enough to live on. She'd never gone back to work after Rebecca was born because Richard had insisted they didn't need the money and the children needed their mother at home. Another decision that seemed reasonable at the time but left her vulnerable decades later. She was scrolling through real estate listings late one night, month 6 of increasingly desperate searching, when she found it. 5 acres of undeveloped land in rural Chatham County, listed for $8,000. The price was absurdly low, which made Nancy suspicious enough to read the full description. Unimproved land, no water, no utilities, no access road, rocky, arid soil, no structures. Zoning allows residential but buyer responsible for all development costs, including well drilling, previous attempts unsuccessful, septic, power line extension. Property has been on market for 8 years. Motivated seller. There were 3 photos. Barren, rocky ground dotted with scrubby vegetation under a harsh sun, a few drought-stressed trees in the distance, and cracked, dry earth that looked like it hadn't seen rain in months. It looked, Nancy thought, like a terrible investment, the kind of property that would eat money in taxes and maintenance while never being usable for anything, which is exactly why it was still available after 8 years, which is also why Nancy found herself driving out to see it the next morning. The property was 40 minutes outside Chapel Hill, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that required careful navigation in Nancy's aging sedan. When she finally reached the plot, marked by a faded for sale sign half buried in weeds, she got out and stood in the morning sun, looking at 5 acres of what everyone would call wasteland. The ground was hard-packed clay, mixed with rocks, covered in patches of dried grass and tough scrubby plants. There was a slight slope to the land, and the soil color varied in ways that suggested different mineral content in different areas. A few scraggly trees clustered in one corner where the ground dipped, evidence of some water collection during rains. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. There was no power line in sight, no well, no road, nothing. Nancy knelt down and picked up a handful of soil, letting it sift through her fingers. The texture was wrong for most conventional agriculture. Too much clay, too compacted, too dry. But Nancy wasn't thinking about conventional agriculture. She was thinking about a paper she'd written in her senior year about xeriscaping and native plant cultivation in the Piedmont region. She was thinking about the tough, scrubby plants she could see surviving here, indicators of what the soil could actually support if someone understood what they were working with. She was thinking about iron-rich clay and how certain medicinal herbs thrived in exactly these conditions. She was thinking about 40 years of botanical knowledge that she'd set aside but never quite forgotten. She was thinking about the box in storage, with her old textbooks and research notes. She was thinking that everyone would call her insane, and she was thinking that she didn't care anymore. Nancy bought the land for $8,000, which left her with $22,000 in savings and no backup plan whatsoever. Her children's reactions were predictable. "Mom, what are you doing?" David had demanded over the phone. "You bought wasteland? You can't even live there. There's no house, no water, no power." "I'm aware," Nancy had said calmly. "Then why would you waste your money on that?" "Because it's mine. Nobody can take it. Nobody can tell me to leave, and I'm going to make something there." "Make what?" "Mom, you're 67 years old. You can't build a house on raw land with no utilities. Be realistic." "I was realistic for 38 years," Nancy had said. "I'm done being realistic." She'd hung up before David could respond and hadn't answered when he called back. Rebecca had been slightly more concerned and significantly more condescending. "Mom, I'm worried about you. This doesn't sound like you. This sounds like a breakdown. Have you talked to anyone? A therapist? Maybe you should come stay with us for a few weeks and we can figure this out together." "I don't need to stay with you," Nancy had said. "And I haven't had a breakdown. I've had a breakthrough. I'm finally going to do something I've wanted to do for 40 years. Which is what? Grow things." There had been a long silence. Then, "Mum, I love you, but this is concerning. You're talking about living on undeveloped land at your age. What if you get hurt? What if you need help? Then I'll figure it out like everyone else has to," Nancy had said, and ended the call. Neither of her children had contacted her since, which hurt but didn't surprise her. They'd made their choices about whose side to be on, and apparently checking on their mother's well-being wasn't a priority when it might conflict with staying in their father's good graces. Nancy moved onto the land in early March with a tent, a used pickup truck she'd bought for $3,000, and a determination that surprised even herself. She was 67 years old and sleeping on the ground, heating water on a camp stove, and using a portable camping toilet. It was uncomfortable and hard and deeply humbling. It was also the first time in decades that she felt like she was doing something that mattered, something that was entirely hers. The first month was just clearing and assessing. Nancy walked every inch of her 5 acres, making notes about soil composition, drainage patterns, existing vegetation, sun exposure. She collected soil samples from different areas and tested them with a kit she'd ordered online, documenting pH levels and mineral content. She identified every plant species growing wild on the property, noting which ones were thriving and what that indicated about the soil conditions. She sketched maps and plans, consulting the botany textbooks she'd retrieved from storage. At night in her tent, she read by flashlight, not novels but scientific papers she found online about sustainable agriculture in arid climates, xeriscaping with native plants, soil improvement techniques, water conservation. She rediscovered knowledge she'd buried for decades and found it still sharp, still relevant, still exciting. The work was physically demanding in ways Nancy hadn't anticipated. She'd let herself become soft during her years as Richard's wife, comfortable, sedentary, carefully maintained. Now her hands blistered and calloused. Her back ached from digging and hauling. Her body protested every morning, but something in her spirit sang. She started with water, the most critical resource. She couldn't afford to drill a well which could cost $20,000 or more with no guarantee of finding water at a reasonable depth, but she could collect rainwater. Nancy designed and built a simple rainwater harvesting system using salvaged materials. Several large food-grade barrels she bought used, gutters and downspouts she salvaged from a demolished building, and a filtration system she constructed from plans she found online. She built a simple frame structure with a slanted roof covered in metal sheeting to maximize water collection. It wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. When the spring rains came, she collected hundreds of gallons. It wouldn't be enough long-term, but it was a start. For longer-term water, Nancy studied the land's natural drainage and identified a low area where water collected during rains. She spent 2 weeks digging, by hand, because she couldn't afford machinery, to deepen and shape this natural depression into a small pond. It was exhausting work that left her physically spent every night, but when the next storm came and the pond filled, Nancy stood watching water pool in the basin she'd created and felt something close to joy. The pond wouldn't be drinkable without treatment, but it would support plants and provide humidity. For drinking water, she made trips to town to fill containers, rationing carefully. Next came the soil. The clay-heavy earth was compacted and nutrient-depleted from years of neglect. Nancy couldn't afford to bring in truckloads of topsoil, so she did what farmers had done for centuries. She composted. She collected organic waste from restaurants in town, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, anything plant-based they were throwing away. She gathered leaves from parks. She hauled in aged horse manure from a nearby farm whose owner was happy to have someone take it away. She layered it all in composting bins she built from salvaged pallets, turning it regularly, managing moisture, watching decomposition transform waste into rich, dark compost. It took months, but Nancy had time. While she waited for compost to mature, she started preparing planting areas. She couldn't improve all 5 acres at once, so she focused on a 1/4-acre section with the best sun exposure and drainage. She broke up the compacted soil with a broad fork, brutal work that had her arms trembling, and began amending it with her finished compost, working it in by hand until the texture slowly improved. By June, 3 months after moving onto the land, Nancy had her first planting beds ready. She didn't plant vegetables or flowers. She planted native medicinal herbs, plants she'd learned about in her university courses, plants that thrived in poor soil and drought conditions, plants that had pharmaceutical applications, Echinacea purpurea, various native salvias, Monarda species, Asclepias tuberosa. She planted carefully, spacing properly, mulching with shredded bark she got free from a tree service company. She watered sparingly from her rainwater barrels, training the plants to develop deep roots. And then she waited. Nancy lived simply. She built a more permanent shelter, not quite a house but better than a tent, using a combination of salvaged materials and basic construction techniques she learned from YouTube videos. It was 12 feet by 16 feet, with a concrete floor she poured herself, walls framed with lumber and a metal roof. It had windows salvaged from a demolition site, a door she bought used, and basic insulation. She wired it for solar power, a small system she purchased and installed herself after weeks of research. It provided enough electricity for lights, a small refrigerator, and charging her phone. She built an outdoor kitchen with a propane stove. She installed a solar shower. She made a composting toilet that was considerably more pleasant than the portable one she'd started with. It wasn't comfortable by her old standards, but it was functional, and it was hers. By late summer, her plants were established. Most were thriving. The native species adapted well, developing deep root systems and showing healthy growth despite minimal watering. A few species struggled, which gave Nancy valuable data about what would and wouldn't work. She took notes constantly, documenting everything, building a knowledge base about her specific microclimate and soil conditions. In September, Nancy met Tom Chen. He was a retired agricultural extension agent who'd heard through some unclear grapevine about a woman trying to farm 5 acres of terrible land without a well. He showed up unannounced one afternoon in a dusty truck, introduced himself and said, "I heard someone's trying to do something interesting out here. Mind if I take a look?" Nancy was suspicious at first. Her trust in people had been thoroughly shattered, but Tom's manner was straightforward and professional. He walked her property, examined her plants, looked at her composting system, studied her water collection, and finally said, "This is really impressive work. You're doing this alone?" "I am," Nancy confirmed. "What's your background? Agriculture degree? Permaculture training?" "Botany degree from NC State 1980. Never used it. Until now." Tom had smiled then. "Well, you're using it now. This is good work. Really good. You've got some interesting species choices here. Are you focusing on medicinals?" "I am. The soil composition and climate here are surprisingly well suited for certain pharmaceutical herbs. Not ideal, but workable. Have you thought about certification? If you're going to commercialize medicinal herbs, organic certification could significantly increase value." Nancy admitted she hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been focused on just making things grow. Tom offered to help her navigate the certification process, which required documentation and inspection, but was achievable. He also offered something else. "I'm retired and honestly pretty bored. My wife passed 3 years ago, and I've been looking for something worthwhile to do. Would you mind if I came by sometimes? Not to take over, this is clearly your project, but to consult. I've got 40 years of agricultural extension experience. Might be useful." Nancy studied him carefully. "Why would you want to help me?" "Because what you're doing is interesting. You're taking genuinely bad land and making it productive using native species and sustainable techniques. That's exactly the kind of agriculture we should be promoting more widely. Also," he paused, then continued honestly, "I'm lonely. My kids are across the country. I don't have many people to talk to about the work I used to love. This would give me something to engage with again." His honesty was disarming. "Okay," Nancy said finally, "but this is my land and my project. I make the decisions." "Absolutely. I'm just offering expertise when you want it." Tom became a regular presence over the following months, visiting once or twice a week. He brought knowledge and connections, introducing Nancy to other small farmers, helping her understand market opportunities, connecting her with the Organic Certification Board. He also brought something Nancy hadn't had in a long time, someone who treated her as competent, who respected her knowledge, who engaged with her as an equal. They developed a comfortable working relationship that felt like partnership rather than dependency. By her first winter on the land, Nancy had transformed a 1/4 acre of wasteland into a thriving medicinal herb garden. It wasn't conventional farming. The plants were spaced widely, encouraged to develop extensive root systems, selected for resilience rather than appearance. But they were healthy, and they were exactly what Nancy had intended to grow. The second growing season was when everything accelerated. Nancy expanded her growing area to a full acre, diversifying her species selection based on what had worked well in year 1. She built proper drying racks in her shelter and began processing her harvest properly, cutting, drying, and storing herbs according to pharmaceutical standards that Tom helped her understand. In June, Tom connected her with Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a pharmacognosist, a scientist who studies medicinal compounds in plants, at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Rodriguez was researching native North American medicinal plants and was intrigued by what Nancy was doing. She visited the farm, collected samples with Nancy's permission, and ran analyses on the medicinal compounds in Nancy's herbs. The results were surprising. The combination of Nancy's soil composition, that iron-rich, mineral-dense clay everyone had dismissed as useless, and her growing techniques had produced herbs with unusually high concentrations of active medicinal compounds. The stressed growing conditions, the wide spacing, the minimal watering, all the things that would have been problems for conventional agriculture, had actually encouraged the plants to produce more of the defensive compounds that made them medicinally valuable. Dr. Rodriguez asked if she could include Nancy's farm in her research study. Nancy agreed, which led to regular visits from graduate students, extensive documentation of Nancy's techniques, and eventually a journal article that mentioned Nancy's farm as an example of successful medicinal herb cultivation in marginal soils. That article, published in an obscure academic journal that Nancy wouldn't have expected anyone to read, somehow caught the attention of a small North Carolina company called Carolina Botanicals that produced high-end herbal supplements and tinctures. They reached out asking if Nancy would be interested in becoming a supplier. The company owner, Margaret Wu, visited the farm in August. She walked Nancy's growing areas, examined the plants, reviewed the lab analyses Dr. Rodriguez had shared, and made an offer. Carolina Botanicals would purchase Nancy's entire harvest at premium organic prices if she could maintain quality and scale up production over the next few years. The contract wouldn't make Nancy rich, but it would provide steady income, enough to cover her modest living expenses and reinvest in the farm. Nancy signed. By fall of her second year on the land, Nancy's wasteland was generating income. She'd spent roughly $15,000 of her original $30,000 on the land, truck, and initial setup. She'd lived extremely frugally on the remaining $15,000. Now she had a crop contract that would net her about $20,000 annually if she could scale up to 3 acres of production. Difficult, but achievable. More importantly, she had something she hadn't had in decades: purpose, direction, work that engaged her mind and body, a future that was entirely her own. That's when Richard showed up. Nancy was working in her drying shed, processing bundles of echinacea, when she heard a vehicle pull up. She came outside to find Richard climbing out of his luxury SUV, looking overdressed and out of place in his business casual clothes and clean shoes. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. "Nancy," he said, his tone attempting warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "You're hard to find. I had to ask around in town to get directions." "What do you want, Richard?" She didn't invite him in or offer pleasantries. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I heard you'd bought some land out here." "I was concerned." "You weren't concerned enough to return my calls for the first 6 months after the divorce. Why the sudden interest?" Richard looked uncomfortable. "I've been hearing things about what you're doing here. Growing medicinal plants, working with UNC researchers. I was surprised. This seems like a big undertaking for—" He trailed off. "For a 67-year-old woman," Nancy finished. "For someone with your resources. This is a lot of work, Nancy. Have you thought about selling? I could help you find a buyer, maybe even buy it myself. This land could be worth something now that you've improved it." And there it was, the real reason he'd come. "How much do you think it's worth?" Nancy asked, curious. "Well, I'd have to assess properly, but with the improvements you've made, maybe 25 or 30,000. I'd be willing to give you 40,000 as a friendly gesture. That would give you a nice profit on your 8,000 investment." Nancy almost laughed. "Richard, I'm generating 20,000 a year in crop revenue from 1 acre with a multi-year contract. I'm expanding to 3 acres next year. This property isn't for sale, and even if it was, it would be worth significantly more than 40,000. Richard's expression shifted to something harder. "Nancy, be reasonable. This is a lot of work. You're not getting any younger. Wouldn't you rather have the cash and less responsibility?" "No." "Nancy, no, Richard. This land is mine. This work is mine. This future is mine. You don't get to take it. Not this time. I'm trying to help you," he said, but his tone had an edge now. "No, you're trying to capitalize on work I did, just like you capitalized on my work for 38 years. I supported your business, raised your children, managed your home. You got to build an empire while I put my dreams on hold. And when I wasn't useful anymore, you discarded me. Well, I'm done being useful to you." "That's not fair," Richard protested. "You're right," Nancy said. "It's not fair. None of it was fair, but it's over. You need to leave." Richard left, clearly angry. and Nancy expected that to be the end of it. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, Nancy received a certified letter from an attorney representing Richard Mitchell. The letter claimed that Nancy had defrauded Richard during the divorce by failing to disclose her business plans for the land she'd purchased, and that since the land had been purchased with marital assets, the $30,000 divorce settlement, Richard was entitled to partial ownership of the property and its revenue. It was legally absurd. Nancy's attorney confirmed that immediately. The divorce settlement had been final. The $30,000 was unequivocally Nancy's property to use as she chose, and Richard had no claim to anything she'd built afterward. But defending against the lawsuit would still cost money Nancy didn't have to spare, and the stress of litigation would be significant. "He's trying to bully you," Nancy's attorney said bluntly. "This suit has no merit, but he knows defending it will hurt you. He's hoping you'll settle and give him something just to make it go away." "I'm not giving him anything," Nancy said. "Then we fight it. But you should know, this might get worse before it gets better. He might drag this out, add claims, try to make it as difficult as possible." The attorney was right. Over the next 4 months, Richard's legal team filed motion after motion, requested document after document, scheduled depositions and hearings. Nancy spent hours dealing with legal paperwork instead of working her farm. She paid her attorney with money she should have been using to expand her operation. The stress ate at her sleep and her peace. Then her children got involved. David called, his tone cold. "Mom, Dad's really upset about this situation. He's trying to be reasonable and you're being stubborn. This lawsuit is expensive for everyone. Why can't you just compromise?" "Because I didn't do anything wrong," Nancy said. "There's nothing to compromise about. He's our father," David said, as if that explained everything. "He's also the person who gave you $30,000 when he could have left you with nothing. He's the person who took a house worth $400,000 that I lived in for 30 years and gave me $30,000. He's the person who built a business while I raised you and managed his home. He's the person who chose to leave me for a woman your age. And now he's the person trying to take the one thing I built for myself." "You're being vindictive," David accused. "I'm being honest, and I'm done with this conversation." She hung up. Rebecca tried a softer approach a week later. "Mom, I know you're upset with Dad, I get it. But this lawsuit is tearing the family apart. Can't you just talk to him? Maybe work something out, for the sake of keeping the family together? The family was torn apart when your father had an affair and divorced me," Nancy said quietly. "And it was torn apart again when you and David chose his side. I'm not the one who broke this family, Rebecca. I'm just the one refusing to pretend everything is fine. Mom, if you want a relationship with me, it's available, but it can't be conditional on me giving in to your father. I've spent enough of my life managing other people's feelings and compromising my own needs. I'm done." Rebecca had hung up without another word. The lawsuit dragged through summer and into fall. Nancy kept working, kept expanding her operation, kept meeting with Tom and Dr. Rodriguez and Carolina Botanicals. She didn't let Richard's legal harassment stop her progress. And then something unexpected happened. A reporter from the News and Observer, Chapel Hill's local paper, was doing a story on sustainable agriculture in North Carolina and had been connected to Nancy through Dr. Rodriguez. The reporter, Jennifer Park, came out to interview Nancy for what was supposed to be a small feature. But when Jennifer learned about the lawsuit, Nancy mentioned it casually while explaining why she was behind schedule on some projects. The story shifted. Jennifer did her research. She found the divorce records, public information. She interviewed Dr. Rodriguez and Carolina Botanicals about Nancy's work. She even managed to get quotes from Tom about the agricultural significance of what Nancy had achieved. The article that published in November was titled, "From Divorcee to Agricultural Innovator: How One Woman Turned Wasteland into Profit and Why Her Ex-Husband Wants a Cut." It was detailed, well-researched, and made Richard look exactly as petty and greedy as his lawsuit suggested. The article included information about the divorce settlement, Richard's marriage to a much younger woman, and his current lawsuit claiming ownership of the farm Nancy had built alone. It quoted Dr. Rodriguez, calling Nancy's work agriculturally significant, and Carolina Botanicals describing her as an invaluable partner in sustainable sourcing. The piece went mildly viral, at least viral by agricultural news standards. It got picked up by several farming and sustainability blogs. It showed up on social media with commentary about ageism, divorce law, and women rebuilding after loss. Suddenly, Nancy's lawsuit had public attention, and that attention was not favorable to Richard. Within 2 weeks, Richard's attorney filed to dismiss the lawsuit without prejudice. Lawyers speak for, "We're dropping this but not admitting we were wrong." Nancy's attorney called it what it was. He doesn't want to go to trial with public opinion against him. This would have been bad publicity for his business. The lawsuit was over. Nancy had won, but the victory was exhausting. She'd spent 6 months fighting instead of just farming, spent money on legal fees that should have gone to her operation, and suffered stress that affected her health and peace. Still, she'd won. Richard didn't get any part of her farm. The land stayed hers, the work stayed hers, the future stayed hers. And something else came from the media attention: opportunity. Nancy started getting emails and calls from other women in their 60s and 70s who'd gone through divorces or loss, women who felt like their useful years were over, women who were inspired by Nancy's story. Some just wanted to share their own experiences. Others asked for advice about starting over. A few asked if they could come learn about medicinal herb farming. Tom suggested turning this interest into something structured. "You could teach workshops," he said. "There's clearly demand. People want to learn what you're doing." Nancy was hesitant at first, but eventually she agreed to host a weekend workshop. Introduction to medicinal herb cultivation for small spaces. She expected maybe 5 or 6 people. 23 women showed up, ranging in age from 58 to 76, all wanting to learn how to grow medicinal herbs. Nancy taught them about soil testing, plant selection, sustainable water use, and processing techniques. She shared her story honestly: the divorce, the wasteland purchase, the hard work, the legal fight. At the end of the weekend, several participants asked when she'd host another workshop. That first workshop led to quarterly workshops, which led to a waiting list, which led to a small seasonal internship program where women could come spend a month working on the farm and learning intensive sustainable agriculture. Nancy built a simple bunkhouse with solar power to house interns. Tom helped her develop curriculum. Dr. Rodriguez sent graduate students to present research. Carolina Botanicals sponsored some of the programming. The farm became more than just Nancy's livelihood. It became an educational center focused on teaching older women agricultural skills and sustainable living. Nancy called it Second Growth Farm, a name that worked both botanically and metaphorically. 3 years after Nancy had bought 5 acres of wasteland for $8,000, Second Growth Farm was producing medicinal herbs on 3 acres with revenue of approximately $45,000 annually, hosting quarterly workshops that brought in another $12,000, and running a modest internship program. Nancy wasn't wealthy, but she was comfortable. She'd built a real house, small but solid, with good solar power, a proper well she'd finally been able to afford to drill, and even a small composting greenhouse. She was 70 years old and doing work that mattered, teaching skills that helped others, and building something that would outlast her. On a warm October afternoon, Nancy was teaching a workshop on fall planting when she saw a car pull up and 2 people get out, her daughter Rebecca and her granddaughter Sophie, who Nancy hadn't seen in over 2 years. Nancy excused herself from the workshop and walked over. Sophie was 15 now, taller than Nancy remembered, with Richard's features but something softer in her expression. Rebecca looked nervous. "Hi, Mom," Rebecca said. "I know we haven't talked. I know I should have reached out sooner, but Sophie asked if she could come meet you, and I wanted to see what you've built." Nancy looked at her granddaughter. "You wanted to meet me? I read about you," Sophie said quietly. "The article, and then I found your website for the farm. What you're doing is really cool. I wanted to see it, and I wanted to meet you. Mom and Dad always said you were too busy to visit, but then I read the article and realized that wasn't true. They just didn't want to visit you." Rebecca flinched but didn't deny it. "I owe you an apology, Mom, a lot of apologies. I was scared to lose Dad's approval, and I let that fear make me cruel to you. I convinced myself you were being unreasonable, when really you were just standing up for yourself. I'm sorry." Nancy looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw genuine remorse, not just the performance of it. "Come see the farm," Nancy said. She gave them a tour, showing them the growing areas, the drying shed, the processing room, the bunkhouse for interns. She introduced them to Tom and Dr. Rodriguez, who happened to be visiting. She let Sophie see the workshop in progress. 20 women learning about sustainable agriculture. When they were alone again, Rebecca said, "This is incredible, Mom. You built all this." Not alone. Tom helped with expertise. Dr. Rodriguez opened research doors. Carolina Botanicals gave me a market. "But yes, I built it. I'm proud of you." Rebecca said, and her voice broke slightly. I know I don't have the right to say that after how I treated you, but I am, and I'm ashamed that I wasn't here to support you. You can be here now, Nancy said, if you want to be. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going back to being who I was. I'm not going to be the mother who puts everyone else first and herself last. I'm not going to manage your relationship with your father or smooth over conflicts. I'm done being that person. I know, Rebecca said, and I don't want you to be. I want to know who you actually are, not who we needed you to be. It was the beginning, not of returning to their old relationship, but of building something new, something more honest. Sophie started visiting regularly, helping on the farm during summer breaks, learning about botany and sustainable agriculture. Rebecca came sometimes too, cautiously rebuilding a relationship with her mother based on who Nancy actually was, rather than who Rebecca had expected her to be. David never reached out. Some relationships, Nancy learned, couldn't be repaired, and that was okay. You couldn't force people to see your worth, and you couldn't make them respect what they'd chosen to dismiss. Richard remarried Melissa in a lavish ceremony that Nancy heard about through Sophie. Apparently it was extremely expensive and well attended. Nancy felt nothing about it. Not anger, not jealousy, not satisfaction. Just nothing. Richard belonged to a past life that no longer had power over her present. On the 4th anniversary of buying the farm, Nancy held a celebration, an open house where current and former workshop participants, interns, research partners and friends gathered to mark the milestone. Over 100 people came. Tom gave a toast about agricultural innovation and sustainable practices. Dr. Rodriguez presented findings from 4 years of research conducted on the farm. Several former workshop participants shared stories about how learning from Nancy had changed their own lives. One woman had started a small medicinal herb business. Another had begun teaching gardening classes at her senior center. A third had simply found purpose and community after a difficult divorce. Nancy stood watching it all. This community that had grown around the farm, this impact that rippled outward from 5 acres of land that everyone had dismissed as worthless, and felt the same clarity she'd felt that first day, standing on barren ground with nothing but botanical knowledge and determination. She'd lost a lot when her marriage ended. The house, the financial security, the identity she'd built over 38 years, the relationships with her children that she'd thought were solid. It had been devastating. But in losing everything, she'd discovered what remained: knowledge that hadn't expired, strength she hadn't known she possessed, and the capacity to build something meaningful from dust. At 70 years old, Nancy wasn't winding down or accepting limitations. She was in her second growth, the stronger, deeper growth that comes after pruning, after hardship, after the soft parts fall away, and what remains is resilient enough to thrive in difficult soil. The farm would continue. The workshops would expand. The interns would learn and carry knowledge forward. And Nancy would keep growing, both plants and herself, proving every day that 67, 70, 75, or any age is exactly the right time to finally become who you were always meant to be. If you've ever been told you're too old to start over, if you've ever put your dreams on hold for decades while caring for others, if you've ever wondered if there's still time to use the knowledge you've been carrying unused, Nancy's story is for you. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the best revenge isn't proving others wrong, but finally proving yourself right. That knowledge never expires. That difficult soil grows the strongest roots. That sometimes losing everything clears space for what you were always meant to build. This is the community that proves second chances have no age limit, that what the world dismisses as wasteland might be exactly the ground you need, and that the strongest growth happens after everything else has been stripped away. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age,